I'm a colleague of Anel Muri in Spain in the Institute of Space Sciences in Barcelona, and she couldn't be here. So I will give this review instead of her on her behalf, which is going to focus on the diagnostics of magnetic fields that we have toward protostars. So really the smaller scales that we'll talk about at the conference this week, I guess. And here are two reviewed articles that were published recently that really do a nice summary of this kind of diagnostics, as focusing on the polarization, on the dust evolution, again on the scales of protostars and disk at young ages. So I will focus on the protostellar stage, which is really the phase where most of the accretion onto the star occurs. Typically, protostars are found in the densest place of molecular clouds, where the color density, as we've seen, the millimeter is the highest. But sometimes also we can see them, these very young and embedded protostars in the infrared, as shown here in this serpent-south molecular cloud. So these protostars designate the younger stage where the star accretes mass from its disk in rotation, from its surrounding infalling envelope. And typically, the energy budget of these systems are dominated by the accretion. The accretion dominates by far the energy of the protostar itself. So this is what sets the temperature, typically, of the system. And as I said, this is during this stage where the star acquires its mass, its angular momentum, its magnetic field. And this is why we're really interested in understanding how the global budget of mass, angular momentum, and magnetic field evolve through scales. So this is really via the accretion that all these properties are transferred from large scale to small scales, from the envelope to the disk, and then to the star. And typically, if you put these protostars in such an envelope mass versus luminosity diagram, you realize that protostar really transfer from this high envelope mass, high luminosity to the lower side on the right of the diagram, and counting these stars in each of these zones tells us that actually this phase is very short. It's less than 10 to the 5 years, meaning that there are not a lot of protostars at this very young stage. So we know them pretty well, and this makes the survey sample typically around 100 objects for the local star-forming clouds in nearby 400 parsec. And this review talk focuses on magnetic field. Here you have a plant map of the magnetic field toward the Perseus molecular cloud. And what we try to do with ALMA, typically at small scales, is to understand how this large-scale magnetic field transfer into magnetic field structures at small scales, at the scale of the envelope and the forming disk. And typically, the physics rolling these diagnostics are threefold: the dust evolution, the ionization, and the magnetic field. Obviously, the magnetic field, we want to understand its role in redistributing the angular momentum during this phase. But this role depends on the dust and on the level of ionization. Why? Is because in this very dense medium, the gas is typically neutral. The recombination rate is high, given the large density. This means that the small grains are the charge carriers. They dominate the charge budget, which means that they are responsible for the coupling between the magnetic field and the matter. So this ionization is set by the small grains. Small grains will evolve during this stage. They start to grow, and the size distribution evolves significantly, at least one order of magnitude during this stage. So the population of small grains which sets this coupling change. And we want to understand how much and to what extent this affects the role of the magnetic field in governing the dynamic evolution of this system. And we observe the magnetic field typically in the millimeter through the observation of linear polarization of the dust thermal emission. We see polarization at lower scales, from Planck to ALMA scales, from the dust emission. This means that dust, first, are aspherical, and second, they align themselves. They align, typically, we know they align their minor axis with the orientation of the magnetic field because they rotate around this axis, and they are able to maintain this angular momentum axis with the magnetic field through alignment mechanism. So we know that observing the linear polarization tells us the plano-scale magnetic field orientation. And typically, before the advent of ALMA, the polarization measurements were focusing on high mass objects, and the typical result could be well like this, where the linear polarization were typically detected toward the peak in the Stokes total intensity map. But now with the advent of ALMA, we can go beyond and actually resolve map of magnetic field with respect to the density, with respect to the gas velocity. And typically the first result was trying to see whether all the radiative transfer effects in the line of sight actually could affect or not the orientation of the magnetic field with respect to the orientation of the polarized emission we get. And this is a nice result that's showing a grid of MHD models synthetically observed in polarization to show that actually the difference between the magnetic field integrated in the line of sight and the linear polarization is actually small, meaning that we should trace relatively well the magnetic field at these scales with ALMA. So it's a nice result, and this tells us that we can actually analyze this polarization and interpret them as maps of magnetic field. And as a result was that the dispersion of the polarization in the plane of the skies is well correlated with the polarization fraction, which also depends on the dispersion of magnetic field in the line of sight. This means that the level of disorganization of the magnetic field is about isotropic, and the evolution of the fractional polarization depends a lot on the level of organization of the magnetic field. So we understand that if we see high polarization fraction, the magnetic field is organized, and that helps us to interpret these maps in light of the morphology, 3D morphology of the magnetic field. And these are typically ALMA observations of such linear dust polarization at the scales resulted by ALMA, typically from 100 AU to a few thousand AU for the nearby object, the nearby protostars. So you can see a variety of morphology where the magnetic field is or shows consistency with the density structure, with the disk azimuthal orientation, or with the outflow cavity walls, as we can see here in these maps where the blue and red contours show the outflow ejected from the center. But also, we tend to obtain very complementary results on larger scales for ALMA observation of further away objects, typically high mass protostars, high mass dense star forming clumps, where the dynastic tends to evolve because obviously the scales are different. The turbulence has some influence on the gas dynamics, which tend to also differ the type of diagnostics we can have of these magnetic field maps. Another nice way to diagnose this magnetic field is to perform the, analysis of the polarization map at different scales. Typically, this is done in star forming region where the density structures are relatively organized from scales to scales. Here you can see 3 different scales: the Planck scales, the single dish map. I think this is just GMT, and then this is also the karma vector over here. And we can see a consistency between the evolution of magnetic field for some cores, and from other cores, the history or the natal large-scale magnetic field is lost at the given scales of the dense clumps. Meaning that depending on the initial condition, we tend to have an influence of the large scale onto the small scales. It's not always seen, and typically people are trying to relate this historicity of magnetic field conservation with the subsequent evolution, of course, their multiplicity, their mass, their luminosity, and eventually the size of the disk. And let's, for example, take one example of an isolated core. You see here this Planck image of this core subbar globule. So this is the B55 protostars. And you can see here at pretty large scales, I think it's about a few thousand AU, already a bending of the magnetic field lines, indicating this interaction between collapsing matter and the magnetic field. In the infrared, it's pretty dark, but ALMA really revealed the smaller scales of this object, and typically the magnetic field we have. And I'm coming back to this in a couple of slides. To understand the role of the magnetic field, theoretically, we know that it redistributes the angular momentum with scales. Okay, a strong magnetic field will induce a smaller disk because angular momentum is redistributed outward. So this is really an important role in setting the initial condition for planet formation, because the disk size and mass are defined typically by the magnetic field strength that we expect. However, other effects are hindering this role, typically the non-ideal MHD effect. Non-ideal because the ionization is not ideal, okay? Which means that the coupling between the matter and the magnetic field is not 100%. So these diffusivity terms tend to hinder this role of magnetic field, and the challenge is to quantify them, to understand them. And guess what? They depend on the dust. The dust, which are the charge carriers, define this diffusivity term, which in the end define the role of the magnetic field. And typically, theoretically, we can compute that and find that the disk radius scales with this diffusivity, but most importantly, with the magnetic field that threads these unfolding structures. And let's go back to B55, this isolated protostar I showed you at a large scale. We saw impacts of we saw bending of the magnetic field lines. Actually, ALMA revealed an important bending of the magnetic field lines. Typically, you can see here, the axis of symmetry is about horizontal. This is the axis of the outflow ejection. And the magnetic field is well organized, extremely pinched toward the center in the direction of the gravitational potential. And this is well reproduced with such MHD simulation that implements a similar mass and a strong magnetization. In this case, this pinching of the magnetic field line really suggests that the role of the magnetic field is very important. Typically, the disk size in this one is very small, less than 10 AU. Okay, so it's an example of an ideal case where the magnetic field govern or play an important role in the dynamics of the envelope, which is not the case everywhere. And this is what we want to diagnose in several objects to understand this role of the magnetic field in population, of course. Typically, from other models, we can show that the initial alignment between angular momentum of the core and initial magnetic field also define the role of the magnetic field in regulating angular momentum. Larger disks can be formed here when the initial misalignment is high. Typically, a smaller disk where the magnetic braking efficiency, this redistribution of angular momentum, is higher. And this is what we try to illustrate in observation of the magnetic field in samples, right? In surveys of protostars in linear polarization. This is an example of such survey here that compare the velocity gradient at the envelope scales with this misalignment between angular momentum and magnetic field. And you can see this trend where larger kinetic energy is seen toward larger misalignment, meaning that the magnetic field role has been suppressed in this misaligned case, which is then an important diagnostic to help us to understand the role of the magnetic field in setting the dynamics of the gas at small scales. And larger surveys also, for example, focused on the disk sizes. Here you have an example of this survey, this Van survey computed toward Orion and Perseus. This Calypso survey here toward a nearby star-forming object with the Plateau-Burr interferometer, and which led to the measurement, to the systematic measurement of disk size of these protostars for different evolutionary stages. We can see here younger objects have a smaller disk size than the more evolved class 1 object. This could be interpreted again as the relative role of magnetic field across ages in its regulation of the angular momentum. A new survey actually was performed recently with ALMA toward Orion. It's called BOPS, B-Field Orion Protostar Survey, which is a really first coherent survey made toward a single star-forming cloud with ALMA. So it's really nice progress in the scientific production of ALMA regarding the magnetic field of local protostars. This is typically 80 protostars observed in Orion, where an interesting correlation again was seen between the disk size and the misalignment between the outflow and the magnetic field. So this is the first time this such correlation, which remains tentative, is seen, meaning that we again did a step forward in characterizing the dynamic role of the magnetic field. And people are also trying to, actually doing this toward, as I said at the beginning, toward further away cloud, typically much massive, where the scales, the special scales that ALMA could target already focus on more dense core scales and the typical scales where fragmentation occurs. And this is interesting it's very interesting to quantify this fragmentation of the cores with respect to the initial mass of the cloud with the morphology of the magnetic field, because we know that more homogeneous, coherent morphology relate to stronger magnetic field. And so people have tried to relate that with the level of fragmentation, an important diagnostic towards star formation, because this sets really the distribution of mass of stars. And typically, I only mentioned so far the linear dust polarization, so the plane of the sky map of magnetic field orientations that only tells us the orientation, not the intensity. This is really what we want to have in our diagnostics, right? The intensity of magnetic field, this is what we want to measure and quantify it and compare it with the gravitational energy, with the kinetic energy. So far, it's not really possible at ALMA scales, because such observation of the magnetic field versus density can only be done with Zeeman observation, only attempted toward large scales with typical single-dish telescopes. And toward the ALMA scales, so as I said, envelope scales between a few dozens of AU and 1,000 of AU, such Zeeman observation are still lacking. So we tend to rely on other things to quantify this magnetic field intensity. Typically here, a method is outlined. It was mentioned by Philippe on Monday, the David-Chandrasekhar-Fahmy method, which has several caveats at the scale of protostar. The magnetic field governs the dynamics of the gas, which means it governs the level of magnetic field organization, meaning that it's no longer really correlated with the turbulent energy. This means that this method has a lot of caveats and could not be really applied beyond typical scales of 0.1 parsec, where gravity really dominates the inflow and affects the subsequent turbulence. But what we can do is really focus on the morphology we have in 2D and try to infer magnetic field intensity. And this is typically done in a number of papers right now. Over the years, people are really trying to analytically describe the magnetic field morphology and compare it with the energy we have in hand. The mass is well known. The kinetic energy also with the dense gas tracer, we can quantify the specific angular momentum, the gradient, the velocity gradient of streamers and their mass. It's possible. And so people are trying to quantify that, to quantify the curvature of the magnetic field, and try to, with an analytical physics, to relate this curvature with magnetic field intensity just from the energy balance, the force balance between what could do the magnetic tension and what could do the gravitational potential, and how these analytical models compare the two together. So it gives interesting results, but again, we still lack direct measurements such as Zeeman. So another idea, and this is really what could trigger some discussion for the topic of this conference, is, or it's more a question, right? How to compare MHD models of collapsing protostars, where we mimic a star with a sink at the center, accreting the mass, where we reproduce more or less the magnetic field structure, the density structure, the outflow, etc., with observation of ALMA, where we have the mass, the magnetic field orientation. How to compare them? Are they comparable? It's still an open question, but maybe there is work to do in this field to really make use of the large number of MHD models and the large number of ALMA observation in order to, via some algorithm, to recognize in the structure the physics, the initial magnetization, initial mass, and rotation. And finally, I come to the last piece of the talk, which is how to diagnose the level of ionization. It's a very hard thing to do. Typically, what could be done is to look at different chemical abundance ratio, the ionized species versus the neutral species to constrain the ionization. Typically here, the cosmic ray sets the ionization. And this is an example of a paper who tried to compute this the cosmic ray ionization rate toward the center of this prototypical V335 protostar, where these authors found a very high value, or pretty high value, of the cosmic ray ionization rate, suggesting that maybe the protostar and the accretion mechanism itself are good at producing this cosmic rays locally. And finally, the dust. As I said at the beginning, the dust is also responsible for the for the coupling between magnetic field and matter. And in simulation, we see this very well. If you remove the small grains, the resulting disk dynamics are totally different, meaning that the disk size and mass are different. And understanding, therefore, this proportion of small grains where we know they tend to grow is crucial to observationally constrain the expected role of the magnetic field. And this is done typically on the model side with new dust coagulation models that are able to compute the dust growth and fermentation on the fly in image simulation. And I refer here to this Koala project that computes self-consistently the dust growth and fermentation at every time step in the Ramses MHD models. Very interesting work. And observationally, we tend to rely on the dust emissivity measurements on the millimeter side, typically the beta and the spectral index of the dust emissivity in the millimeter, and relate that to the envelope properties to constrain, using models, the evolution of those grains in mass and in size. Sorry. All right, skip this, and I just have a couple of slides to illustrate a path forward in this field. So I'll skip that also because Philippe already mentioned the very nice result of the BFriend survey performed with the new instrument Negatupole on the IRAM 30-meter telescope. But we are, through the Enigma large program team at NOIMA, developing the polarization mode of NOIMA. Okay, so this is a nice result comparing the polarization at 3 millimeter from NOIMA with the one done with ALMA. It's pretty consistent. It's coming up. Stay tuned. And also, we are involved in this Prima project. It's a far infrared probe. It's a NASA concept that proposes to launch a probe that will be able to observe the dust polarization in the far infrared, typically between 100 and 200 microns. And this will offer such a high sensitivity that allegedly some dust grain model could be constrained, as well as typical environmental conditions such as the irradiation. And you have here an example of such models where this part here of the spectrum is very crucial to constrain the dust grain models using this polarization efficiency. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Valentin. Are there questions for Valentin? No question. So I have one about dust grain size. You showed a graph with different starting grain size. That was it was there, and I was sitting here, so I didn't see it very well. It was about 1 micron size, I guess. My question is, what is the size, the dust grain size you assume in this environment in protostars? Are we speaking about 1 millimeter grain size or micronic grain size?
They are the one we can produce in models, and this is so much dependent on the recipe you have in your model, and they are the ones that you can constrain observationally that rely on models as well. So I say this is really one path forward that I expect would really deserve more development, because on the model, much more physics has to be incorporated to have a consistent dust grain size evolution, like the magnetic clumping, the fragmentation, etc., and the grain structure in this. And observationally, you can see the error bars are high, and this typically depends a lot on the protostellar characteristics, mass, age, eventually dynamical context. So we are still far from relating the two. But to go back to your question, I think it's start to be coherent to assume that you have at least grain larger than 1 order of magnitude than in the ISM. Okay. And this comes back this comes from several diagnostics using this beta, but also using the polarization and the grain Lyman physics. This result seems to be to do a consensus.
Okay, thank you. Here.
So, Valentin, in the case of the polarization vectors, how do you usually compare the case of magnetic fields are very important and that's why they're so well aligned compared to magnetic fields are not important and they're just being dragged by gravity and that's why they're so well aligned? How do you disentangle that? I guess mostly kinematics, no?
So yeah, I come back to the measurement we have, right? If ALMA 2040 or SK could give us Zeeman measurement, that will really solve the problem. Once this is said, I guess, yeah, this is really progress could be made really toward the characterizing of the magnetic field structure with respect to the energy we can constrain, kinetic and gravity. So this really rely on our knowledge of the system, the energy budget that we think is present, and our capability to recover the morphology very well for different phases, the dense and the less dense phases. And I think for now we'll always rely on such models or such analytical model to relate the morphology with the intensity and therefore with the relative role of the magnetic field. Right now, I don't see other ways than this, to indirectly compare the different forces together. And some sources are obviously more magnetized because they are symmetric, they are organized around the outflow, they are single objects, they have a small disk. And some sources are really the opposite. They fragment at less than 100 AU scale. They are disorganized, they're not symmetric, etc., etc. And the gradient in velocity is high. So we have a spectrum of condition and we can put protostar in, right? And this, I think it's about it for such a global trend of the role of the magnetic field.
So a few years ago, there has been discussion about whether the measurements were really showing the magnetic fields lines, and because of the coupling of the dust. So where do we stand? Here it seems to work. Do you have any? Does it depend on the scale?
Yeah, mostly depend on the scale. You must rely on the optically thin regime to have a good correspondence between the magnetic field integrated in line of sight and the polarization that you result in. As soon as you are starting to be optically thick, then either you lose this polarization information or you start to absorb from aligned grains and you can flip the polarization. Or in some cases, it's so optically thick and the geometry is so regular, then you can have those grains self-scattering their own light and produce polarization, typically at disk scales. So because we tend to know this mechanism well, that when you have, for example, a multi-wavelength observation in polarization, it start to be understood what to trust and what to allocate to what mechanism.